everybody. Welcome back to Shannon's Lumber Industry Update. Today, it's episode 62, and I'm kind of calling this one Buying Specialty Woods. Basically, I got a whole lot of kickback and feedback. I don't know, I guess that's the same thing. That's Wood Talk speaking, kickback. I got a lot of questions, comments on the Tonewoods episode that raised additional questions, which kind of are framing the format of this episode. So while a lot of people are referencing the Tonewood episode and last episode, I think it's leading to the idea of what happens when you need a very specific either species or cut or treatment to lumber for the project that you're building, and how do we go about doing that? So should be kind of an interesting little side discussion that was spawned by the highly specialized nature of Tonewoods. So as usual, I always like to say thank you to the patrons who support this show. Patreon.com/lumberupdate is where all the magic happens. I had several new patrons this week, and I do sincerely appreciate you guys helping me to keep the show going. A little bit of industry news I want to talk about because people are going to ask me about it anyway, but certainly we've talked about lumber prices like in 3 different episodes since the whole COVID thing began. We saw those prices drop pretty substantially. They were down pretty low middle of summer, but we did just see a spike here again in the fall, and we've seen those futures pretty much double, nearly double, up to about $700 per 1,000 board feet. Now, some people are panicking, saying, oh my God, supply chain crisis, blah, blah, blah. I do think that there's some merit to saying the supply chain crisis is affecting some of this. There's no doubt that many sawmills still have labor shortages and still have difficulty getting trucking. International lumber sawmills, things like that, are having trouble actually getting containers and ships to carry them. That is certainly a problem. I think labor shortage is more the bigger issue, but you also have to recognize that there is a severe spike in lumber demands come the fall. Many of the vacation destinations don't have a lot of construction going on during the summer months because that's when people are using their vacation homes or when the resorts are fully booked. So when the fall rolls around and things start to slow down, first of all, there's some communities that have a construction moratorium during the summer months because nobody wants to go to the beach and hear, hammering and sawing going on all the time. I'm reminded of that John Candy movie, Summer School, where his neighbor is not Summer School, that's Mark Harmon, Summer Rental with John Candy, where his neighbor is using a circular saw all day long and it's driving him crazy. That type of thing is not allowed in a lot of the higher rent districts. So contractors and such, they have to get all of their work done from like Labor Day to Memorial Day. So there's a lot of projects that get put off during the summer months and just start up again come the fall. Moreover, there's just substantially more construction going on. I look at just my own woodworking habits, and a lot of the hobby woodworkers I know, we don't do a whole lot in the summer, but come back to school time, we're like back to the shop time as well. It's just kind of a circadian rhythm that we follow. And the construction trade does the same thing. So while there have been huge demands for lumber to begin with that have compounded labor shortages and supply chain crisis, we saw things drop as things became a little bit more available, as more people were working on stuff during the summer, working on filling those gaps in the supply chain. Well, now the demand has just spiked again, and we're still a little bit hamstrung, mostly from the labor shortages. And of course, it's going to drive those lumber futures up. So if you remember, I predicted that the prices would fall, but they would never return to where they were pre-COVID. And I still stand by that. I do think 700 per 1,000 is a bit high, but I also think that 325 or whatever it was is unrealistic. So there we go, folks. That's all I can really say about it at the time, because honestly, I'm so tired of talking about lumber prices. Who knows anymore, right? We just know that they're up and they're down and they're volatile. And if you're surprised by that, welcome to the stock market. That's just the way things are. So let's get into the feedback we had here and try to shape this episode into talking about specialty woods. So Joe wrote in with basically the thought was recognize that you can get really technical all day long about tone woods and about soundboards, but in the end, sometimes you just have to test them in the wild. And I think I said this. I'm not sure if I said it or I just thought it, but sometimes the magic of a good guitar you just got to play it, and you can't predict it. And Joe has an anecdote where he was in a guitar shop doing a little bit of shopping, and he had the same model of guitar, same species. It was an Ash guitar. It was solid body, same pickups, everything. And there were 7 of them in the store, and he picked up and he played his way through all 7 of them, and he got a different character, a different timbre from each one until he finally landed on the one that was like, ooh, that's the one that I want. And at face value, or I should say on paper, same species, same general look and appearance, same finish that was used on it, same pickups that were used on it, same everything, just the organic nature of that Ash gave a certain tone that he liked in one of those 7 guitars that the others didn't have. So we can get technical all day long. Sometimes there's just no explanation for it, and you just have to kind of trust the loveliness that is the organic nature of woods. So that brings me to Rob. At the end of the Tone Woods episode, I talked about how that magic that I'm just speaking about, that organic tone, has always been difficult to synthesize, literally, with electronic instruments. But I did say that I do believe the technology has gotten a lot better, because in the end, it really is just mathematics. It's harmonics and understanding overtones and subharmonics, or overtones, or I should say undertones, or subharmonics, if you want to call them that. And Rob says that if you weren't already aware of it, check out the concept of physical modeling as applied to music and musical tech. It's pretty much ubiquitous in electric guitar processing now, and should be much bigger in synthesis than it is after some very promising early products. But it's probably the future of synthesis and expression eventually. Most of the scores you're hearing on Netflix are already being done largely or entirely with expensive professional orchestral sample libraries, though it's unfortunately hard to sell a studio exec at this point on hiring an actual full-size orchestra. So I had actually heard that before, and Netflix is certainly one example, but I've also seen several Hollywood productions where the orchestra has actually been replaced. Now, the musicians out there are not happy with this, and I don't really blame them as a musician myself. But it is interesting when you do break it all down, you do realize it is mathematics and synthesizing. If we have the processing power and the understanding, the ability to actually create and sample well, we ought to be able to create that same organic sound. We shall see, right? Who knows if it's all smoke and mirrors. You got to have a good ear. Some person has a more exceptional ear than I do, can absolutely tell the difference. It's like the same people who say there's no substitution for vinyl, and all you whippersnappers with your MP3s and your compression loss is just terrible. You need to listen to vinyl. So yeah. But what I really want to get into is a voicemail that Andrew sent in that I found particularly interesting.
Hey, Shannon, Andy in Central Pennsylvania, calling into the show for the second time. Loved the Tone Woods episode. I've been looking forward to having one, and with your background in music and physics that we're now learning about, you obviously are the perfect guy to do this show. I know you could do a whole series just on Tone Woods. You can't cover everything. I just have 2 questions, see if you might want to touch base on a little more. One, the quartersawn nature of tops for acoustic instruments. I've known about this for years, never quite sure why. You mentioned rigidity. I'm wondering if there's other aspects to the tone change. As we all know, getting quartersawn stock is one of the more expensive ways to buy wood. So that's, one thing. But you didn't touch on a really interesting aspect of Tone Woods that's become maybe trendy, and that is what they're now calling sinker wood. The wood that's been submerged in water and then taken out, dried, and then used for tone woods. Martin Guitars is currently selling a D35 David Gilmour edition that uses sinker for the backs and sides, and there's other D35s they'll do with sinker. It's a big deal thing. It's harder to get, obviously, a lot more expense. But I had once heard long ago that one of the theories about Stradivarius, and there are many, was that he used sinker wood. And that was some of the uniqueness of the tone that he was able to get. So just wondering if you have any knowledge or speculation even on the sinker phenomenon and whether it really makes a difference or if it's just another way to charge more for premium. Thanks again for the show.
I love that, Andy. Charge more for premium. Well, let me address that, because the first thing, we actually work with Martin, PRS, Taylor, some with Gibson. One of the things that I can say is my dealings with the big luthiers, and I know we've sold to a lot of smaller guitar makers, several banjo makers as well, but they're genuinely good people. Certainly we're all in business, but the Martin guys in particular, they are all about the sound. And I do think that, when you're making instruments, the proof is in the pudding. And if you claim that this makes a better sound and it doesn't, there are people out there who will call you on it. Audiophiles are a militant bunch. Militant's probably the wrong word, because they're still joyful and jolly, but they will come at you in a big bad way if you claim a certain tone or certain warmth of tone exists and it's not there. Proof of that is the number of people who took issue with me saying the Beatles had very specific tone because of the mahogany guitars they played, or that Hendrix had a specific tone because of the swamp ash guitar he made. I had no fewer than 20 people who emailed me and said that I was full of you-know-what, and they change guitars all the time, and that has nothing to do with it. And if I really want to know what I'm going on, look at this particular cut of this particular track, this particular side B, and listen to this bootleg recording of this, and you'll see the tone is different here, here, and here. Audiophiles will call you out. So if a guitar company is claiming something, it's probably not to sell more. Well, certainly they want to sell more, but they have done a fair amount of testing on this. So let's address first the last thing you said about Stradivarius. It is particularly interesting and good timing, and I will post a link to this because Jason shared an article with me where there were some studies done about the Stradivarius violins, and it is believed, the article is a bit sensationalist and a bit absolute in some of its terminology, but it has been researched and determined that it is the finish that Stradivarius used that really aids in creating the sound that is uniquely Stradivarius. He didn't use sinker wood, because sinker wood specifically has been sitting in the bottom of a river for a very long time. And when Stradivarius was making his violins, those logs that are now known as sinker wood, they were actually being floated down the river, or in many cases, they hadn't been felled yet. So Stradivarius wasn't using sinker wood, but the heavy elements, the heavy metals that were in a lot of his finishes helped to kind of augment the tonal quality of a lot of the woods he was using. And I will post a link to this article because it is particularly interesting. As I said, some of it doesn't quite jive, but I do think that there's some real science in there that adds to this. So no, I don't believe Stradivarius was using it. Research the article I linked to, and we'll go from there. Next thing, the quartersawn nature. Certainly, and if I didn't make this clear in the Tone Woods episode, when you have a quartersawn board, it actually is stiffer. If you do a modulus of elasticity test on a flat sawn board, same dimensions, and a quartersawn board of the same dimensions, same species, even cut from the same tree, you will find the modulus of elasticity is higher in the quartersawn nature. And that's due to the structure of wood. When you look at those growth rings running straight up and down across the thickness, you are also looking at those medullary rays running across the surface that are of a denser material. There's more beam strength in that wood, so it snaps back when pressure is put on it, and therefore it is more rigid. And if you remember me talking about the combination of density and that high modulus of elasticity is what gives tone woods what makes for good tone woods. So when you take a good tone wood like Sitka spruce, quarter saw it, you take what was relatively stiff and actually make it stiffer while maintaining a relatively same density, and you're getting an even more resonant tone wood out of that. The other thing, which might be obvious but should be stated, is the dimensional stability of a quartersawn piece. When that wider quartersawn piece is used, in a relatively thin nature, if it were flat sawn, it would warp and move pretty substantially. Whereas the quartersawn nature really allows it to hold its shape a lot more, because if that starts to move and deform and change the volume of the sound chamber, you're going to have real issues. So stiffness helps not only from an acoustical perspective, stiffness can also help just from a structural perspective, because a stringed instrument is under tension at all times. So that's why you're finding those quartersawn things. I think primarily it probably started because people wanted that stability more than anything else. So now let's talk about sinker mahogany. And I've had some questions about sinker mahogany before, and this comes back again to buying specialty woods. There are a lot of lumberyards out there who actually do stock sinker mahogany. It's actually the only way that one can buy Cuban mahogany, Sweetina mahogany, which is a CITES Appendix 1 species. It is illegal to trade it because it can't be felled. But if it is found in the bottom of a river, in other words, salvaged, it is still, you're still able to use this. The Cuban mahogany that I have worked, very, very small amounts of it, was sinker Cuban mahogany. I've also worked with Sweetina macrophylla, genuine mahogany, sometimes Honduran mahogany, Belize mahogany that was sinker mahogany. Just up the road from me in Pennsylvania in Herd Hardwoods, they sell sinker quite a bit. We've brought sinker mahogany in at my job specifically for customers. The thing is, it is huge in the luthier market right now. Where else you find it is in the reproduction markets, because they want that old growth mahogany. So what's going on here? There's a couple things that are happening. Sinker mahogany, or not just, I keep saying sinker mahogany, but sinker woods in general, because there's more than just mahogany, is wood that was felled. We're talking like 18th century, 19th century wood that was felled, and it was floated downstream to get to port or to get to the sawmill. It was dragged out on sledges and things like that, floated downstream to a sawmill. Many of those logs got hung up on the bottom, sunk because there were so many logs, on the river at the time that logs pushed other logs down and they got hung up for one reason or another, and they weren't retrieved. Centuries have gone by, and sediment layer after layer has been piled on top of these things, and they're essentially glued into the bottom, and they're never going to surface of their own. Occasionally, a big storm hits and you get a real gully washer in some of those streams, and something will break loose and you'll see logs drifting downstream that are hundreds of years old. The real key to this is these logs were felled back in completely untouched virgin forests in the 18 and 1900s. They are true old growth woods, very, very tight grained. And, when you hear they just don't make them like they used to, or you can't get mahogany like you used to, or you can't get this species like you used to, it's because they are old growth forests that really, really closely spaced growth rings of a tree that as a seedling grew in total shade, and had to sprout up to get to the canopy and didn't have any branches whatsoever. Perfectly clear, long, straight grained bowls with super tight grain. If you've ever worked with old growth mahogany or sinker mahogany, it is absolutely gorgeous. Now, because of that straight grained, tight growth rings, you have a totally different density. Totally different working properties. It's like a different species entirely. And that density changes those tonal characteristics. And this is why the sinker woods immediately they were grabbed by the luthiers. They're really, really popular in restoration and things like that. But honestly, the big guitar companies, they've got more buying power. They've got more, ability to source directly and buy in volumes. And they started buying up the sinker material because of that tonal quality of that different density. But the other thing that you can't really describe, because essentially what's happening is you're increasing the density, but maintaining a lot of the same rigidity. And if you remember in the last episode, I talked about how lower density and high stiffness make for a good tone wood. So we're taking mahogany, which has the lower density and a good amount of stiffness, and we're adding to the density. So therefore we ought to be subtracting from the resonant quality that makes it a good tone wood. So while you may lose a little bit due to the added density, you're gaining harmonic depth because of those centuries of sedimentary layers that have piled on top of the wood and essentially impregnated the wood with minerals and heavy metals and all kinds of silicic compounds that create massive amounts of harmonics that don't exist in, wood without it. The added density is going to change the harmonic nature, but all of those other little things create harmonic deflection, or subharmonics. So when we talk about harmonics, we talk about the eigenfrequency, the natural frequency of a material. So the eigenfrequency of this particular piece of old growth mahogany will generate a harmonic sequence or a harmonic series of overtones. That series of overtones will be unique to that particular eigenfrequency. Well, when you then change the density and you change the density not only by just older growth material, but then by changing the material composition, adding different elements, adding different materials with dramatically different densities in there, you are taking that eigenfrequency and causing deflections. As the sound wave propagates through it at the speed of light, it is slowed down and deflected and kind of diverted off that path because it hits a really, really dense piece of copper, or a dense piece of sand, silicon dioxide. And those deflections create subharmonics or undertones. And this is where that richness comes from. We actually can create undertones. You think of a stringed instrument, a violin or a cello, by increasing the pressure applied to the string by the bow, you can bend the pitch and kind of flat it a little bit, take it down a quarter tone. In fact, there's some 20th century musicians, George Crumb comes to mind immediately, that have entire string quartets based around this idea of overbowing in order to create undertones. Crumb's Black Angel string quartet is a particularly fascinating one because you'll have three of the instruments in the quartet playing with normal bowing, and the cello pushes really hard and creates that undertone, which creates a different harmonic sequence from the other three instruments. And you actually get the natural harmonic sequence and the undertone harmonic sequence kind of bouncing and competing. In some instances, superposition is coming into play, but in other instances, they're competing with one another like a secondary dominant, creating almost a tertiary harmonic sequence that oftentimes appears kind of acoustically in magical places, like the back corner of the room, because those competing series are bouncing off one another, bouncing off the concert hall. Usually the Black Angel Quartet is performed in a large concert hall with, really, really resonant harmonics. And you get like this weird tertiary overtone series that suddenly just pops up like in the upper balcony. And you're looking over your shoulder thinking, oh, there's a cellist in the upper balcony. And it's actually that secondary dominant or tertiary harmonic sequence created by the two competing harmonic sequences. Sorry, that was a bit of a tangent, but sorry, I'm a fan of George Crumb, if you can't tell. But it's particularly when I'm kind of blowing it into like a macro instance here where we're intentionally creating those undertones. But when you are getting that deflection and subharmonic undertone created just by the sound wave passing through the wood and bouncing off those various sediment layers, you get a totally different sound. You get warmth, you get color that didn't exist before and is not possible to get in mahogany. So lots of things. Sinker mahogany is super, super old. So it's very dense, old growth, dense growth rings. That changes the tone. That adds a little bit more warmth because of the increased density. Adding in all the additional heavy metals and sedimentary layers and silicic materials just completely changes the game. And I have witnessed both Martin and Taylor. Martin is particularly, as you said, really pushing a whole series of Sinker mahogany guitars. You can absolutely hear it. Even if you don't have a good ear, it is very apparent. It's like deep in the chest, the sonorous nature of these Sinker mahogany guitars. You will feel it like resonating your sternum. It's life-changing when you hear it. So yeah, it's no doubt that they're selling a lot of them. By the way, if you're all interested in this whole idea of harmonic overtones and things like that, check out like Tibetan monk throat singing and hearing the harmonics that bounce out of that. Very, very cool stuff, which by the way, throat singing is increased pressure on the cricoid, the base of your voice box, your larynx. That increased pressure in there by singing, first of all, pitching it very, very low, you can get more audible harmonic sequences. Obviously, the higher the natural frequency, the higher the overtones are going to be. So if you pitch that an original note quite low, the overtones are actually audible to the human ear. It starts there. But in order to get that low note to sing in the throat, you're singing with a totally different mechanism than normally, resonating your chords. And that extra pressure at the base of your larynx and the cricoid is what is causing those undertones. It's very, very cool. I know this is a lumber update, and I just kind of went totally off on a geek moment. But yeah, can you tell that I followed a lot of 20th century musicians, and in fact dedicated my senior recital to Charles Ives and 20th century music? So yeah, let's move on. Rob has an interesting point here about, again, tone woods, but buying these specialty woods. He says, I have a consumer question you might be able to answer. Lately, I've wondered a lot about sourcing soundboard wood and panels. There are a lot of vendors supplying it. However, vendors that market wood specifically for soundboards usually sell super bourgeois book-matched top halves, do much of the machining in advance, and charge more for the result than the average guitar in my collection is even worth. Not all of us want to start up building acoustic instruments at that level of financial commitment. However, I'm not yet aware of a consumer quality source for something like, say, the laminates of common tone woods, and who knows what else would be used for cheaper ukuleles and acoustic guitars. I'd like to try building a simple beater uke or acoustic someday, but I'm incredibly annoyed by all of the above. Is there much trade in laminated soundboard material at the industry level, or are manufacturers of cheaper instruments just making their own plywood in-house? So here we're talking about a highly specialized material. We're talking about soundboard, not only soundboard good species, but soundboard cuts, quartersawn, book-matched, wider panels. Oftentimes they're book-matched because they require a wider panel, and already thinned out. Because there is some, by thinning out that material, you're decreasing the density as well, and also messing with the rigidity a little bit. And that's what creates that magical combination. So Rob's concerned because the only place to get this stuff is from luthier suppliers, places like, Stu Mac, or there are several guitar manufacturers who sell kits as well. The answer is, how do you go about buying soundboard material? Well, you buy the species. You source the species first, and you buy it however you can get it. And that is not going to be in a perfectly quartersawn board. It's not going to be in thinner stock. It's not going to be perfect wood. It's going to be whatever the heck you can get. Sitka spruce is not a super commercially sought after species, and when it is sought after, it's sought after by the luthiers. So actually, you could say it is a sought after commercial species, but it's specifically for the luthiers. The luthiers are buying it, and the concession owners who are felling it are talking directly to those guitar manufacturers, those violin manufacturers. They're selling it directly to them, and they're selling the logs, or in many cases, they may be selling the cant itself. They fell the tree, and their local mill is debarking them and possibly cutting them into a cant, and that's all they're doing. One of the things I can tell you from selling to luthiers is they don't want us to touch the wood. They want to do all the milling and machining themselves because the precision they require is of such a different level. The grade and quality and their concept of clear versus my concept of clear is totally different. They will defect some of the most beautiful wood you've ever seen because it won't meet their particular standards, because it's not just about aesthetics, as we've said, it's about tonal quality. So they don't trust anybody to do it. We managed to get PRS one year to actually agree to allow us to mill up some mahogany for them. And they basically stood over the shoulder of my ripsaw operator and the molding operator to make sure that we were meeting the exact specifications. Once we had been able to prove it by making like 100 some blanks, then they walked away and let us machine the rest of it. Most of these manufacturers do all of that milling in-house because the specifications are so incredibly exacting. Not only can you not get a sawmill to do this, they don't trust them to do it. And the sawmill doesn't want to do it either, because there's so many things that can happen downstream shipping from the sawmill. So for the average maker of a guitar, one at a time, you kind of have to buy from those distribution houses because they are taking on the risk. They're buying the raw wood. They're defecting out huge amounts of it that's not going to meet in the process of milling up guitar-ready parts. If you wanted to avoid all of that, you could possibly find a way, if you had a mill, say you're in an area where Sitka spruce grows naturally, you could go to a mill and say, I'd like to buy some Sitka spruce. I will buy a log from you, and they can mill up a cant for you. By the way, if people don't know a cant, imagine taking a round log, and turning it into a square, like leaving as much mass and taking off as little as possible so that you're just revealing like the largest square or rectangle you can get out of that log. There's a cant. You could possibly buy the entire cant from them. It would be probably, if they had a huge order they were filling for, say, Gibson or PRS or somebody like that, you might be able to get one of those cants, but they're going to be trying to fulfill the order of this large paying customer first. But still, you could probably buy it, and then you could mill up, from there. Be prepared to have a lot of material not meet the standards, not meet the grade, and be prepared to have a lot of material to make a lot of different guitars. You're going to have a really hard time buying enough for a single guitar or even a couple of guitars without all of that labor being done first. And this is very much the same with any quartersawn wood. Let's not talk about tone woods. We're not talking about guitar making or instrument making. If quartersawn is your specialty wood that you need to buy, you can find quartersawn in white oak. You can find quartersawn in red oak, pretty commercially available because they're hugely sought after for flooring. A lot of flooring, some for cabinetry. But that's the industry that's driving the sawmills saying, okay, we will waste a lot of wood and saw this specifically quartersawn. You can buy quartersawn sapele because it's highly sought after for that ribbon striping that's so distinctive. There are sawmills willing to take on the added labor and the additional waste of quartersawing because there is a strong market and a price that will make that extra labor worthwhile. There is not a strong market for quartersawn cherry or quartersawn maple or quartersawn walnut. Personally, I love all three of those species in a quartersawn or riftsawn look, but there's not a strong enough demand, a strong enough reason for those species to be quartersawn for a mill to take on that additional expense. And I keep saying waste, but it's because there's a major amount of waste when you quartersaw a log. There are no mills willing to take that on. And this is why, for the most part, you're finding these mills will just flat saw or through saw or plane saw the log and then straight line rip it into boards. And what you get is what you get. And you will get some quartersawn material, you'll get some riftsawn material, and you get a lot of flat sawn material. So if you wanted to specifically source quartersawn material in one of those species that's not known for it, you can go and look through the stacks and you will find some quartersawn boards. In a lot of instances, you might find a specialty retailer that might actually sort that stuff out and put it on a separate rack with a higher price tag, of course. But the other thing to remember is in every flat sawn board, imagine a flat sawn board with that cathedral pattern running right up the center, what you might call a pattern grade board with that nice centered cathedral. On either side of that cathedral, flanking it, is rift and quartered material, because that's how a log is structured. Those circular rings on the log, as they spin out, they curve out in a frowny face or a smiley face, depending upon your mood, from that central cathedral. You get grain lines running 45 degrees and 60 degrees and 70 degrees and 80 degrees and 90 degrees as you move further out from the cathedral pattern, giving you rift material and quartered material. So if you're looking for, say, quartersawn cherry, you could go and dig through the stacks for a while and end up paying more. Or I would suggest going and buying 12-inch wide cherry or 8-inch wide cherry. Buy wider cherry boards and plan to rip it yourself to get your quartersawn material out of that. Buying that specialty material, you can ask for it, but you have to make it worth their while. And if it's 2 or 3 boards, there's no way you can justify that cost, the cost of labor required to do that. Moreover, even if the boards are already sawn, think about you yourself going to the lumber mill and taking the time to pick through 3,000 board feet in order to find the right boards. We do it all the time as hobbyist woodworkers. We think nothing of it because this project we're building is our baby and we want the perfect stock for it. Asking a lumberyard worker to do that, who's paid by the hour, who's got a whole list of orders that he or she is trying to fill. His forklift is idling behind him at this moment, to go and put that same amount of time into it, especially when he or she doesn't actually know what you're making. There's no way that they can possibly pick out the perfect board for the top of your credenza because they don't know that you're building a credenza. They don't know the dimension of your credenza. They don't know what your design idiom is that you're going for. So you can't ask them to do that. So they may take some extra time, but that's, time on the clock. They could be pulling an order that is a much larger volume. So you have to think about those things. The more specialized the material gets, in order to buy it, the more transformation you can expect there to be. In other words, the more milling, the closer to that finished product you will find. There will be some retailers out there who are going to sell good tone wood species, but you're going to get what they have. Don't expect to have perfect quartersawn soundboard ready type material because that's not what they sell. They sell lumber. And in order to go from lumber to soundboard, there's a fair amount of machining and milling that needs to be done there. So the answer here, Rob, is if you're trying to save money on the guitar, I respect that, but there's a reason that a lot of the guitars cost what they do. There's a great deal of labor, not only in the actual construction of the guitar, but the prep of the material and the sourcing of the material itself. So in my mind, if you have a supply house that is doing that work for you, you're probably going to end up actually saving money in the end because you're assuming that you can even get that particular species in, a small volume. That's a big assumption because you're going to have a real hard time sourcing small volumes of tone wood type species. But to say that you can, then think about all the time and labor that's going to go into actually prepping that, all of the material that can't get used that becomes waste. That's, time is money. And I realize for the hobbyist, we don't quite think of that the same way, but all of that has to be accounted for somewhere. And in the end, you're probably better off and cheaper to buy it from a luthier supply house. It's the same adage of, I got into woodworking because I wanted to build the dining table and I thought I could build it cheaper. So you go out and spend $3,000 on tools and $500 on lumber to build that table that you saw in the store for $1,500, It never works out in the end. So hate to be the bearer of bad news. There is no special answer to help you go out and buy this stuff because of the amount of transformation that has to happen to go from raw log or cant to soundboard ready material. So the other thing, I talked about quartersawn, but this, as I said, applies to rift material. Other specialty things, a lot of times people are looking for heart center woods, like for timber framing, because having that pith or the heart right in the center means that you're going to have a more stable cant. It's going to check, but it's going to check on all four faces. So if you have a 6x6 square timber, it'll check on all four faces and you'll end up with a 6x6, or maybe as it shrinks, a 5.5 by 5.5 timber. Whereas if the pith is off center or the pith is not there, you have a free of heart center timber, it will not check evenly. It will check maybe on one face and it shrinks more in one dimension. So what started as a 6x6 cant is now 5.5 by 6. And that can cause problems. So a lot of timber framers, when they're looking for specific stable parts, maybe it's the sill or the long beams, oh shoot, I just left my head. What's that long beam called at the top? Oh shoot, you can tell I'm not a timber framer. But anyway, there are going to be specific parts that they want stability for, and they will specifically source heart center or boxed heart timbers. Well, you can't just expect a sawmill to produce those. You can't just go to a normal lumberyard and say, I want boxed heart material. That has to happen at the sawmill. You're sawing the log differently when your yield is meant to be box heart timbers. First of all, you only get one box heart timber out of a log because there's only one bit of pith in a log, unless it's like a crotch grain species, but you're not going to use that for long straight, beams or anything like that. So that decision has to be made way upstream. It actually has to be made in the forest, because when you know that you're getting a box heart timber and you're specifically usually looking for a larger size and a longer length, the tree itself has to be picked. You can't just go and cut down any tree, because you have to make sure that I'm going to get a 15, 20, 30 foot long straight bowl that's going to yield me that boxed heart material. Free of heart center is another specialty wood, but you'll find that's a lot easier to come by because you can make those decisions at the sawmill. You don't have to make that decision in the forest. You also can saw out a boxed heart section from a log and still get free of heart center timbers from there. But so many sawmills may decide to try to get the most boards, the most pieces out of that log, and they might overlook free of heart center in order to get a greater number of boards. So buying that specialty material, that free of heart center, means you need to kind of special order that. Now, you will find some lumber yards that cater to timber framers, and they're going to have FOHC, free of heart center, or boxed heart materials regularly in stock, or at least have sawmills that they buy from that know that's what they're looking for. So again, and then there's thousands of other kind of specialty type situations that you may run across. And if you are having trouble trying to source those, that's because there's usually an industry need for that particular specialty, whatever it is, whether it's a species, whether it's, a box heart or not. There's a specific need in the industry, and that industry is buying it all up. It's not their resellers aren't buying it. The industry is buying direct from the mill or direct from the concession, and that material never really becomes available to the average consumer. Another example of this, Sharon, who I have to throw her postscript in here. She posted a question and said, by the way, I'm also a hand tool school member, so hopefully that bumps my question to the top of the line. No comment, but your question's in the show. Anyway, Sharon said, your Tonewood episode was perfectly timed to help me decide on swamp ash for my next guitar. The only problem is no one has any raw swamp ash in stock locally or online. Is an expensive body blank my only option? Here again, Sharon, swamp ash is known to be a phenomenal tone wood. Ash, white ash, any of the numerous species of ash, and let's not even mention the emerald ash borer, because that's causing limiting supplies in ash. It's also causing quarantine in certain states on ash. But leaving all that aside, ash is a great wood for flooring. The major use of ash is in flooring. You will find some furniture makers using ash, but most of it is going to flooring manufacturers. And that's whatever ash. It doesn't really matter the species. It can be any number of ash species that will apply there. Swamp ash is specifically known for its tonal qualities. So when a swamp ash tree is felled, you better believe that concession owner is calling a luthier, because they know that here is a specific tone wood. The solid body guitar makers love this stuff. Now, they're also buying regular ash, but they're really going after the swamp ash. The flooring industry doesn't care if it's swamp ash. So they're going to buy, large volumes, but that swamp ash won't garner a higher price tag from a flooring manufacturer, but it will garner a much higher price tag from a guitar manufacturer. And here again, that guitar manufacturer is not buying material and then reselling it. They're buying material in order to make their own guitars. So actually they are reselling it, but they're reselling it in guitar form. Or occasionally those guitar manufacturers will make body blanks available, and they will actually sell them. You could buy them direct from Martin or direct from Taylor or PRS, or you can go to a place like Stu Mac, a luthier distribution house, and buy it from them. And here again, those distribution houses are buying direct from not just the sawmill, but the guy who owns the concession, the person who's actually felling that log. And they know that here's a plantation of swamp ash, or here's a concession that has swamp ash on it. They're reaching out to that guy because they know swamp ash grows in, swampy areas. So they're reaching out to the people that have concessions in those swampy areas, and they're saying, what kind of swamp ash do you have on your property? Okay, I want this tree, and this tree. In many instances, they're buying a tree that won't actually be felled for 10 or 20 years. That's how far upstream this goes. And that's why going to a lumberyard to buy rough sawn, or as Sharon puts it, raw swamp ash, it's just not going to happen. It's not going to happen. If it does happen, it's because somebody made a mistake. It's because somebody doesn't know what they have. They can't tell the difference between one ash and swamp ash, and it just got lumped into the whole pile. And that was a pure mistake. It's like when you find that, fiddleback maple piece in the Home Depot rack. It was a mistake because somebody wasn't paying attention. So yeah, Sharon, your solution, just like Rob was saying, is an expensive body blank is probably your only option. Unless, and if you go way back to the episode I talked about on buying lumber and alternative ways to buy lumber, one of those alternative ways was reaching out to local cabinet shops and millwork houses and buying their leftovers, buying their scrap wood. If you happen to know a guitar manufacturer in your neck of the woods. And it's not just the big guys, folks. There are lots of one-man luthiers out there who may have material that you could buy because they may have an agreement, with Gibson or PRS or somebody like that, and they're buying raw material from them directly. So that's another way, reaching out to them and becoming active in luthier forums and things like that. You'll start to build a network, and you'll find people that can help you out when it comes to buying this material. But I think even then, it's going to be rare that you're going to find a raw rough sawn board. There's probably been some milling or transformation done along the way that's going to drive up the price a little bit. So, yeah. Moving on here. This brings me to Matt, who had questions about Monkeypod and Koa. He starts first with a little bit of kickback on your Tonewoods episode. And this is Matt speaking, while not at all Hawaiian, I was stationed there for a few years recently and tried to learn about and acquire and work with the native woods while I was there. For one, the true Hawaiian pronunciation of ukulele is to use the starting sound of ook as in spook instead of the hard U sound. In other words, ukulele. Matt, I appreciate that. Little fun fact. I technically am Hawaiian. I was born in Hawaii. But I would never say I'm a native Hawaiian because I'm an Aoi through and through. I was an Air Force brat who happened to be on the Big Island, on the island of Oahu when I was born. So yeah, I am not a Hawaiian, although I play one on TV because I was born there. So yeah, well aware that it is called ukulele, but it's one of the things that always drives me crazy. It's like listening to NPR and there'll be some white dude who's talking along and suddenly he saying like a Mexican term or something like that, and he says it in a full accent, and it's like, who are you, dude? Like, don't do that. So yeah, if I started, throwing out my my Hawaiian pronunciation, that would probably throw everybody for a loop, and I'd be getting emails going, "What you doing, brada?" So yeah. Another little side there. This episode, I'm sorry, we should just rename this the tangent episode because I'm not talking about wood today. I'm talking about everything but wood. Carrying on, as we're talking about ukuleles, Matt goes on to say, in regards to koa, I seem to grasp that it is a field tree similar to walnut that mostly grows in the fields of the Big Island. I lived on Oahu. It exists among the cattle, and although koa is a very expensive wood, it's nothing compared to the value of the cattle that graze near it. And so since these farmers are in the business of raising and selling cows, they don't care about the koa trees. They are farmers, not lumberjacks. When these trees do fall naturally, they often aren't noticed by the farmers in time for them to be harvested for lumber before the cows damage them or they have significant rot. This low supply and huge demand has made this tree very expensive. I only managed to purchase one piece while I was out there, and it was a solid piece with mostly straight grain, about the size of two Louisville Slugger side by side. It was $197. I never figured out the board foot cost of that piece, but it was a lot. Koa is hard to find on Oahu and very expensive when you do. Also, similar to walnut, most pieces are very knotty and are only available in small chunks. It's difficult to find koa boards or anything like you would find a domestic species here on the mainland. So yes, Matt, you are absolutely right. Koa is definitely a field tree. It is not a canopy tree. It branches very quickly. It's one of the things that gives it its lovely variegated color, and a lot of the very common curl that you find is the fact that it grows in open fields, often wind-torn fields, not just on the Big Island, but often on the windward side of the Big Island. That's where most of the stuff comes from. Also, one of the great things that gives it its color is that igneous soil. I mean, the and pohoi hoi. How's that, Matt? You like it when I go to my Hawaiian pronunciation there? The igneous nature of that soil that makes the black sand beaches of the Big Island is what gives Koa so much of its character. And it's not growing on Oahu because it's totally different soil chemistry, but also very different topography and different bioclimate as well, different amounts of forest, and just there's so many differences from one island to another. The Big Island definitely has the forest that produced the Koa. But he brings up an interesting point that I know I've mentioned on the show before, but the number one cause of deforestation, folks, is not logging. It's cows. It is cattle ranching because they need fields. And when you're raising cows, like Matt said, you're in the business of raising healthy cows, not healthy trees. So a lot of trees get cut down in order to create grasslands for the cows to graze on. So yeah, it is very common that the Koa falls and doesn't get used, although I think much less common because this has become a known fact for the lumber suppliers or the sellers of Koa, and they will often reach out to those farmers, just like I was talking about a second ago about reaching out to the local guitar or banjo maker or the local millwork house and building a relationship with them. These resellers of wood will reach out to these farmers and say, hey, you have an untapped resource here. So would it be okay if, this tree is relatively old now, can I come in and fell it? I'll take it off your property and I'll pay you for it. Or this tree fell, or if you know that a tree fell, please call me and I will actually buy it for you rather than it just rotting and you getting no money for it. So that is not as much of a problem anymore. You're not finding that the wood is going to waste because the market demand has meant that people have decided to get creative about this and build relationships with those farmers themselves. It is incredibly expensive, though, just because the Big Island is still quite small. Now, Koa has been planted and is growing successfully in other regions of the world with similar climates, and we are starting to see Koa coming from other places than Hawaii. So I still don't think it's going to change much in the way of the price, just because it's still a relatively small geographic distribution for the species. And just the nature of the tree means that it's not going to grow big and strong and get really, really big boards. But that high amount of figure and variegated grain makes it so highly prized. It will always be treated like a figured wood. And anybody who's bought figured wood knows you just can't apply a board foot price to it. The unique nature of figured wood means that market board foot price means absolutely nothing. It's like when you go to the seafood restaurant and you see the lobster dinner that has no price next to it, it just says market price. You know it's going to be expensive because it's, high demand. In this case, you're dealing with a unique item that you just can't put a board foot price on. Now, Matt continues and says, well, on the topic of Hawaiian woods, can you explain to me a bit about monkeypod? It grows all over the island, but is usually only taken down in the way of new construction. It is also similar to walnut in its growth, but often you can find some clear species, especially because it's prized for its sapwood and live edges. It's also pretty expensive out there at over $15 a board foot in most shops. Crazy thing, though, is it's similar or possibly the same tree as acacia, which is dirt cheap when you're buying a brand new bread bowl from Target. Can you shed any more light on monkeypod and its relation to acacia? Also, why is acacia so plentiful and inexpensive in a lot of modern home decor, Target, Pier 1, etc., compared to monkeypod? So let's address the last part first. Monkeypod and acacia are not the same thing. You will find that there are some similarities, but monkeypod, as you intimate, has started to develop its own market, and it is very well known that this is a different species and should be treated as such. Acacia, however, is not actually a species of wood. It is not even really a genus of wood. It is a conglomerate, whole bunch of species, like thousands, literally thousands of species get lumped under the name acacia. A lot of them are Indonesian species, Southeast Asian species, South Pacific species that all get felled and run into one central sawmill area, all sawed as one. Usually at that sawmill, it's sawn into smaller parts and glued up into those large finger jointed board type panels that are then sold en masse to the manufacturers who are turning bowls or making furniture and things like that in Indonesia or Southeast Asia. And they're shipped to the retailers in the US and even Europe as furniture, not as wood. It's made out of acacia. Sometimes you'll find some suppliers, like a lot of the big, like Pier 1 type folks who are sourcing, they actually have a line into and may actually own the company that's actually making the furniture. As a way to cut costs, they've acquired more of the links in the supply chain. And some of them will actually throw out a genus and species. This particular acacia is made of this acacia, meloxinin, blah, 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 blah. And I'm dubious of that because when you just take a couple steps further up the supply chain and know that these logs are being felled in like no fewer than 20 different countries and all floated together into one sawmill, probably in Java or Sumatra somewhere, sawn into boards and then glued up into large panels, which are then shipped over to like mainland Asia and turned into furniture. Yeah, I'm sure someone has started to do this, but you got to have the buying power of an entity like IKEA before you can fully have control over the supply chain like that. So the reason that it's so inexpensive is it is a sweatshop industry. I mean, it is a near endless supply of wood. The stuff grows like weeds all over with an enormous geographic distribution. There's very little attention paid to grade or color because, the grade, you can always increase the grade of a species of wood by decreasing the cutting size. I can get a board that's actually riven with rot and knots, but if I'm cutting out, a 3/4 by 3/4 by 6" long pin blank, I can get a perfectly clear board out of that. And if you have no regard to grade because you're just going to cut it into strips and small staves and glue them together into wider panels, you can buy the dirtiest of dirt cheap material, put very little effort into the milling of it because all of it is going to be, made higher grade in the glue factory later on. Huge amount of reduction in cost, huge amount of reduction in the cost of labor. All of that brings huge amounts of material into the furniture manufacturer with a lot of the milling already being done because in order to glue up those large finger jointed panels, you had to obviously S4S it at some point. It was run through a molder and those finger joints were put on the end. So it was glued into this panel. So when the furniture maker gets it, instead of starting with raw material that has to be jointed and planed and all that, they already have a panel. It's like building with plywood, essentially. And they can put it on a CNC machine, have it cut into whatever pieces, put it on a CNC and turned it into a bowl and put into a crate and shipped over to the US. It is a sweatshop industry. And I shouldn't say sweatshop because it's got negative connotations, but at the same time, that might actually be apt in certain instances. But it's not to say they're all bad. There are legitimate and sustainably sourced and well paid laborers in the supply chain out there somewhere, but it still is a mass production industry. So that's why it's so inexpensive. Monkeypod, however, is a different genus, different species, in many instances a different family from a lot of the species that get rolled up under acacia. You're right. It's found its market is live edge material. It's found its market as that sapwood live edge material and oftentimes is felled and sawn like right there in the forest into these larger chunks that is then taken and used for mantelpieces and shelves and things like that. Monkeypod, certainly it grows in Hawaii, but that's not where most of the stuff comes from. You find that it's coming from Central America and South America more than anything else. And like when you walk into a lumber yard and you're buying Monkeypod, or you walk into like a restoration hardware and anthropology and you're buying a shelf or a mantle that's made out of Monkeypod, that stuff is coming from Central and South America primarily. You also will find it in Australia. And Tasmania, Papua New Guinea, all that Oceania area down there, you're getting Monkeypod coming from those areas. And it is a gnarly wood. So like I said before, you can get a clear or desirable cut of wood out of any gnarly wood just by reducing the cutting size. So they're cutting away all the nasty stuff and leaving you with what is desirable in the open market. And that now has become its own. I mean, the fact that people have actually heard of a weird species like monkeypod tells you that there is a market for it. And it's largely because of retailers like, I keep saying Anthropologies of Restoration Hardware. I don't even know if they carry such things because I haven't darkened the doorstep of one of those places in decades. But those type of stores, they're the ones that are marketing this material for live edge shelving and things like that. And that's now where the demand comes from. So there we go. There again is another specialty wood. Monkeypod, if that's specifically what you're looking for and you can't find it in any of your retail lumber yards, you might look further downstream to the people that are actually selling the finished product, that finished live edge shelf, and discovering where they're getting their material, or buying their material, stripping the finish off and using it for whatever you want to build it out of. So there we go, folks. That's the buying specialty woods. We kind of went down some very specific rabbit holes, but those are specialized rabbit holes, right? When you start talking about specialty woods, it's kind of the same story. It doesn't really matter what it is. And I'm sure I will get people say, well, what about this instance? Or what about balsa? Or, we talked about basswood in the past and fishing lures and things like that. Basswood is one of those species that is very difficult to find in anything but like carving blocks. And it's very difficult to find it in like 4/4 and 5/4 lumber. It's not impossible. It's just the market says this is what people want, is big hunks of it for carving. So the sawmill is sawing it into those hunks. I can tell you, we have a company who sells those carving packs. You can buy figure carving, small sculptural carving stuff. You can buy a box of 12 blocks of basswood. We sell lumber to a company that does that. We sell boards to them that they then rip and mill and turn into those small carving blocks. We had to actually go to a sawmill and specifically say, okay, we want this. We want 5/4, 6/4, 6/8 wide lumber, because our customer wants to mill it himself. We had to actually place a special order with one of our sawmills in order to do that. If you want basswood boards, and basswood's not impossible to find, but you'll find that it's a rarer species. If that's what you want, you generally have to make a special order at the sawmill itself. So there we go. Anyway, my point is, you could probably think of 20 more specialized examples, and it's the same answer. It's what is it that makes it specialized? What is the industry that has made that specialized? And more than likely, you'll find that industry is buying direct. And for you to buy one or two pieces direct, or even, it's not lucrative for the sawmill to do that. I appreciate the questions, folks. I appreciate the immense amount of feedback that just on not only the Tonewood episode, but the Softwood episode. A lot of really positive responses to those. I myself felt they were pretty good episodes, so I felt good about them. I'm glad to hear that you guys like them as well. Thanks as always for the questions. Please keep the questions coming. You can go to lumberupdate.com. There's a form you can fill out to submit your questions there, or you can email me at lumberupdate@gmail.com. Most of our questions this week came into the inbox directly. It's the best way to send those recorded voicemails as well. So thanks, everybody. Go buy some lumber. Go buy some specialty lumber. But if you do buy specialty lumber, let me know where you found it, because that stuff's hard to find.